At this point, we've had a general overview of Confucian thought. But now it comes time for us to really understand this Confucian thought by a comparison with what is the predominant stream of Western thought. Now, Western thought began, Western philosophical thought is widely said to have begun with the Greek philosopher Socrates and the person who wrote his writings down, Plato. Some would say it was Plato who invented Socrates. But one way or the other, that's the start. And the train of thought from Plato and Socrates can be extended through Aristotle, through Roman philosophers like Cicero, on through the medieval tradition in people like St. Thomas Aquinas, reaching into the Renaissance with people like Machiavelli, and then in terms of political thought, in the Western world, in the British world in particular, to people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. It's this strain of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes that I want to talk about, to give you a kind of model for the kind of thinking that is predominant in the West, particularly in Britain and the United States. These two philosophers had a very simple logic, and that simple logic can be compared to the Chinese logic to show wide differences in the philosophical strengths of both sides. When I say there are wide differences, though, I want to indicate that in certain ways they are attacking a common problem. The common problem of government in general is the problem of disorder, of violence. In small groups, it's the danger of random violence. As groups get larger and they become towns and cities, there becomes organized violence by roaming gangs or other nations or other towns. So, this is a common problem for the Chinese, and it's a common problem in the West. As is described by people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, it works like this. They argue that all human beings have a right to self-preservation. This right to self-preservation, they believe, comes from a law of self-preservation. The right of self-preservation is a perfect right for every human being. The problem is, as individuals, it's hard to enforce or protect that right of self-preservation without government. For Thomas Hobbes, he compared the situation to a state of nature. He said there was a state of nature. Everyone had a right to self-preservation, but it was very difficult to enforce because, as he described human life in the state of nature, it was, to quote Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes' answer was for there to be a collective government that would protect everyone. This was often monarchical, but it also could be described as democratic, where all the people together gathered together and created a government to protect themselves. Locke, coming about 100 years after Hobbes, saw a problem in Hobbes' presentation because Locke saw there was no limit on Hobbes' government. And that would mean that Hobbes would create a government to protect everyone, but then would have a government that couldn't protect anyone else. So Locke, as a modified position, began to argue that two things needed to be done. One, a government needed to be created to protect everyone's individual rights, and at the same time, safeguards had to be imposed on the government to protect the individual rights of citizens against their own government. If any of this sounds familiar, it should, because it's the kind of fundamental underlying logic behind the American Revolution and the American Constitution. The Declaration of Independence talks about the rights, the self-evident rights of men, and these are sought to be made possible for them to be exercised by citizens in the United States because of the existence of the Constitution. This Constitution also speaks to a rule of law, so that there's a rule of law that is higher than any of the people who run the government. This is an attempt to replace the rule of law with the rule of man. It is a philosophical tradition that is still recognizable, still a part of political debates in America today. And it is this general framework that I'm going to use as a counterpoise to the Chinese point of view. Key to this mode of thinking is the notion of individual self-preservation, of individual rights, of rights that are protected by the government because they are written as guarantees in a constitution, and because of a belief that the rule of law is preeminent, they are protected for all future generations. We're not talking 1789 here, we're talking the 21st century. These are still supposed to be relevant factors. Now, all of this is fine, and it is the kind of point of view that our government expands and wishes to offer to other countries around the globe. Except it doesn't fit very well for the Chinese. Now, the Chinese start out with a concept not so far away from the state of nature, that is nasty, brutish, and short. They're vitally concerned as their greatest fear in something they call luan, or social disorder. This is the kind of social disorder that is brought on by wars, by civil wars, by major disorders, by disruptions. But it doesn't start from a premise of individual rights. It starts from a premise of collective goods. What is the collective good for all of the people? How do we achieve this collective good in such a way as to protect the people from the Chinese concern about luan leads to the opposite of luan, which would be harmony, peace, and benevolence. How to achieve harmony? From this collective perspective, the thought of Confucius focuses on the need for harmony, and therefore the principal focus is not on creating a government, it is on perfecting individuals in society. How best to protect individuals in society? Well, one thing would be to create a hierarchy of order where people understood their position in society and could perfect themselves within a structure of hierarchy. Already, we're at a major difference with Western thought. Instead of talking about the individual rights of people who are presumably equal, we're now talking about the position of people in a communal order that is hierarchical. The well-known hierarchies, and to be very clear, if you take all of the Confucian hierarchies, they are more than just 5. But the 5 that are most frequently mentioned are emperor, subject, husband, wife, father, son, older brother, younger brother, and neighbor versus neighbor, where, despite the apparent equality of the neighbor versus neighbor, there's actually a hierarchy, because the older neighbor always outranks the younger neighbor in the hierarchical system. Now, to the American or the Western way of thinking, these hierarchies fly in the face of what is supposed to be the equality. But it's worth defending the Chinese thought in this way. While Westerners are inclined to talk about equality, they immediately recognize that it is only an equality before the law, or, as it's sometimes called, an equality of opportunity. It's not, in fact, an equality of condition or outcome. We're well aware that some people are better basketball players, faster runners, better pianists, better artists, and have more money or more intellectual accomplishments than others. So it's not equality, it's just equality before the law. The Chinese seek to promote harmony, and this equality before the law means that people are set in a competitive struggle with one another to see who's the best. And this competitive struggle can lead to conflict. For Confucius, a better idea, not necessarily a better idea because I'm advocating it for Confucius, but for Confucius, the thought was that recognizing that hierarchies existed meant that you could avoid conflict from people constantly striving with one another in a comparative way to see who was better. Instead, all of the focus was to be on internal improvements, to make yourself the best possible person you could be within the hierarchical structure that he established. So everyone would seek to be the best emperor, but one would also seek to be the best subject. One would seek to be the best husband, but then one would seek to be the best wife, the best father, the best son, the best older brother, the best younger brother, the best neighbor. This sort of thinking is the typical Confucian thought. And you cannot rule out that it will work for an agricultural society in particular. It does seem to have worked well to give the Chinese the kind of position they've had over the last 2,200 years. What is that position? Well, that's the position where the Chinese have the largest population in the globe. They have, if we could measure it, and we don't have complete numbers, but if we could measure, it's a virtual certainty that they have produced more GDP year in and year out than any other single society around the globe. They have also achieved the greatest number of books at the time of the American Revolution. More books have been written in Chinese than in all of the Western languages combined. They had developed all of the inventions, or I'm sorry, they had developed half of all of the inventions on the globe. Wow, that's quite an accomplishment for a society that is based on hierarchy. But what makes the hierarchy work is a special characteristic. The Confucian view is that hierarchy, with higher prestige and presumably higher power, has to be balanced by benevolence. There's a reciprocity here that demands that those who have the higher prestige, those who have the higher political or powerful positions, are required to take care of those who don't have that position. It is the reciprocity that makes the Confucian system a continuing humane system, or a continuing humane society. Now, having said all of this in defense of Confucianism, I want to be clear that I'm not advocating Confucianism. I am simply suggesting that it's important for us to understand the opposite point of view. What other issues? Well, flowing out of this hierarchy is the notion that those who are in the lower reaches have to show respect for upper reaches. At the bottom, when we're dealing with neighbor versus neighbor, the younger neighbor has to show respect for the older neighbor. The younger brother has to show respect for the older brother. The older children have to show respect, the males have to show respect for women. The women have to show respect for their husbands. The husbands, as subjects of the emperor, have to show respect for the emperor. All of this is subsumed under a general concept known as filial piety. This filial piety is a critical part of maintaining the harmony and the benevolence of the system. On top of this, we then get a generalized human response called benevolence, so that all of the Chinese are expected to show benevolence toward everyone else, following the rules of hierarchy, but also showing this benevolence even to people with whom they are not directly related. The notion, the Confucian logic that goes from the individual to the family, to the village, to the county, to the province, to the nation as a whole, and in reverse, from the emperor to the provincial rulers, to the county leaders, to the village leaders, to the family head, that logic is meant to promote a harmonious society. Does it always work? No, it doesn't. And does the Western proposition that we should always obey the law, that there should be no murders, there should be no bank robberies, can we say that our system has produced that? No. There'll be violations of the system. Individual violations of the rules do not negate the entire cultural logic. That is the essence of what we're trying to do in understanding how Confucianism works. Now, as we go through subsequent lectures, we're going to see some limitations on the Confucian system, because almost every philosophical system, almost every cultural tradition has its high points, has its positive attributes, but some of them tend to lend themselves to certain dysfunctional characteristics, and we will take those up in subsequent lectures.